warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. To everybody joining from Bristol and beyond. Welcome to our webinar, our Islamophobia Awareness Month webinar. We're joined by some very excellent speakers. Apologies for the rather shaky camera. My tech is not working as it should be doing today, so I'm joining you from my phone. But thank you again for joining. And Islamophobia Awareness Month, although we've just missed it by a day, we thought it was very important for us here in Bristol to have an event to discuss Islamophobia in Bristol, to discuss how we can move going forward. And I've got some members of the community, as it were, here to speak to you all today. So Islamophobia Awareness Month, it's a campaign founded in 2012 by a group of Muslim organizations, including MEND. It aims to showcase the positive contributions of Muslims, as well as raise awareness of Islamophobia in society. This year's theme is tackling denial as to whether Islamophobia exists at all, and we'll be discussing that, but also denial about the way that we're approaching it. Are we in denial as Muslims? Are we not taking this threat seriously? And are we not supporting the organizations that exist? In terms of what I've been doing, I think for the past year or so, I've been actively involved in trying to prevent mentorship within the legal community. So I am part of the Association of Muslim Lawyers, and I founded a legal program called Legal Guides. And that was born out of my own personal experiences with Islamophobia. And in my case, I'll just share the small anecdote with you. It wasn't vicious, it wasn't violent, but it was the typical essence of workplace Islamophobia, what people in the workplace can experience. I was a young trainee, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and due to the fact that I was going off to pray, due to the fact I didn't drink, I really was made to feel unwelcome in one department that I was in. At the time, I just thought it was, a series of strange things which were ostracizing me from the group. The fact that, for example, I went off to pray, the fact that I didn't attend certain team parties which were quite boozy. And I think after I'd left that department and had some time to think, and actually even having left that firm, I thought about it, and I think I came to the conclusion that was Islamophobia. It was me being treated differently despite my work ethic, despite the things I was doing because of my faith. So it's something that I'm very passionate about, Islamophobia Awareness Month, and my firm, the firm I work for, Fraternity, we are an official supporter of Islamophobia Awareness Month 2022. And I was pleased to attend the launch of the Islamophobia response unit on Monday in London. It was a great opening event, and I was touched by the stories that the speakers and that the organization staff had to share. But enough about me, and time to introduce my guests now. So could I please ask the admin to bring our guests to the stage as well? I'd like to welcome Rizwan Ahmed and brother Aamir to this webinar. Assalamu alaikum to you both. Rizwan Ahmed, a guy who needs no introduction, mashallah, a Bristol legend. Riz, would you like to do a brief introduction as to what capacity you're here in today, and kind of your initial thoughts on tackling denial? Do you have any kind of general thoughts on tackling denial?
Okay, Assalamu alaikum, and thanks for having me here.
I think you might be on mute, Riz.
Oops, hold on. Can you hear me now? I should be off mute. So, can you hear me?
Aamir, could you just put your thumbs up if you can hear Riz, because I can't hear anything.
Yes, we can hear you.
You can hear Riz. Okay, it's just me then. All right. Sorry about the tech issues, everybody.
Would you like me to carry on?
I'm gonna leave and rejoin. I think. Sorry.
All right. Okay. I'll crack on, Karen. I'll introduce myself then. So Assalamu alaikum, everyone. So my name is Rizwan. I'm currently outreach lead for Bristol Muslim Code Society. I also work as an outreach worker for Ahmed Somerset Police, and I'm one of the Muslim chaplains at City Bristol College as well. In terms of my background, I've been involved in giving presentation and training around demystifying Islam, Islamophobia awareness, through BMCS for the last 10 years, and I used to give presentations to about 3,000 people every year, and I reached out to about 30,000 people over the last 10 years, and that's people coming to us for that, not me going out to them, because of the reputation for the work we had. Because I had a reputation for delivering in a down-to-earth, easy, digestible way that people could relate to. I also done training around end-of-life care for Muslims, cancer hospices, the NHS and mental health care in the Muslim community. I've also used to engage, well, I still do sometimes with TV and local radio. And what else did I do? And I've advised on TV productions as well in the past. And I think the most high-profile one was the Spanish Princess on Amazon Prime. That was a very eye-opening experience. So, but alhamdulillah, the key thing is, at grassroots level, I've been out there dealing with Islamophobia, and I'm a very passionate advocate for, and I'll share stories later on about, changing mindsets and dealing with people through education, dialogue, and that human contact. I've seen myself personally the impact it's had, sometimes had an emotional impact on people. And then coming back to what you said earlier, I think it's about, what was it about, as Muslims, how we can tackle it. And
tackling denial is the theme of this month, I think, this year. So
tackling denial. So I think what I've learned through experience, and this is with the Muslim and non-Muslim community actually, is there's denial about the level and different level to which it exists within different parts of society. So I think we've got institutional Islamophobia, which many people don't realize exists. Then you've got it at workplace, which some people do experience. Then there's grassroots level. And what I found is that because we all exist in our own different social spheres, we all got our own little face group friends and followers, etc., or LinkedIn anywhere. What tends to happen is that we all live in these individual echo chambers. So when I go out and talk to Islamophobia to non-Muslims, they're like, "Oh my God, we just didn't know that," because it's not coming up in their Facebook feeds. Whereas for us guys, as a community, whenever something kicks off, it goes viral. We all hear about it. We all hear on WhatsApp and LinkedIn and Facebook, because we're all in that that little social sphere. So
bubbles.
It's bubble. Yes, it's not always a case of denial. It's lack of awareness something. But then sometimes you do get people, with more far right leanings who think, actually, no, you lot are just kicking off and making a fuss for no reason. Within the Muslim community, I would say there's denial around, or maybe I would call it apathy and denial around the level at which it's happening. So they know it's happening, but the typical response might be, "Oh, it's all because of the media." But what they don't realize is that you have to be proactive and do something about it. And I think sometimes there's a conditioned helplessness around it. So people think, you know what, the government, let them sort it out, or let the police sort it out. That's not going to work. And I'll talk about that later on, why we can't have that
I agree.
attitude. We've got to be proactive. And yeah, I'll stop there because I'll go on too long. Yeah, but I think I'll touch on that. I'll come back to that later on, where we have a discussion about what we as a community can do about it, as well, and building and how to build allies and allyship, etc. Because that's all very, very important in dealing with it as well. But the key thing I would say before we introduce next brother is, education, dialogue. Trust me, and when I talk about it later on, you'll see how powerful that is and what impact that can have on people as well.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And especially the point you raised about bubbles. Now, it's okay for us in Bristol, a fairly multicultural city, a fairly liberal city, to talk about, how much progress has been made. But if you go out to Trowbridge, if you go out to Pill, if you go out to the edges of the Muslim community, you'll find that Islamophobia is unfortunately thriving. There will be shopkeepers who are insulted. There will be arson attacks, as you've heard about, on the news recently. It exists, and just because it doesn't exist in our community, it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing all we can to challenge Islamophobia. Before I introduce Aamir, I'd mentioned that even a government itself can be Islamophobic. For example, I would argue that the Nationalities and Borders Bill had elements in it which would unfairly remove citizenship from Muslims. And at the Muslim Association of Muslim Lawyers, we have been campaigning against this bill, in particular Clause 9, which allows for the stripping of citizenship without notice. So your citizenship could be stripped by the Home Office, the Home Secretary, if she decides that you have just said something which is contrary to the values of the UK. Your nationality can be stripped. Now, that is firstly such a vague point of legislation that I think anybody should be concerned, Muslim or not. But this legislation, it affects anybody really with one parent that is not a UK national. So it basically unfairly targets the majority of Muslims. My father is from overseas, therefore I'm at risk of having my citizenship withdrawn and revoked, despite the fact that I've lived in this country my whole life. Now, I argued this on Monday with Nazir Afzal and very senior members of the community who are concerned about Islamophobia, and that point was agreed upon by almost everybody, that legislation itself can be Islamophobic. But without further ado, I introduce my dear brother Aamir, who was the previous president of Bristol Islamic Society. Aamir has had previous experience with Islamophobia. And Aamir, I guess the first thing I'd ask you is, firstly, tell us a little bit about yourself, your experiences with Islamophobia, and then we'll go on to tackling denial and what exactly you have to contribute to this theme of this IAM 2022.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So, Jazakallah khair for having me on. I don't know if you can hear me. Can Rizwan? Yeah.
Yes.
So I was the president at 2020-2021. So that's 2 years ago, during my time at Bristol ISOC. So I want to talk a little bit about Islamophobia in educational spaces, and because that's what my experience is. So as part of our ISOC year, we plan for the year, what we're going to do, but never at the start we realized we were going to face something as big as what we faced. Essentially, it was about a module that's being taught within the law school, led by a professor who's been teaching this module for over 15 years, never sort of received a major complaint about the content. It was brought forward by a sister who was picking that module, and the sister forwarded some of those thoughts to ISOC, saying that this is what's about Islam at the university, at the law school. And essentially there were points about religion, our religion, in a very negative light. And it wasn't net square, it was showing verses from the Quran and Hadith and some of the Muslim culture in the Arab world, quote unquote. So the narrative was portrayed in a very sort of negative light, like I said earlier, without having the other sort of views, counter views. I was quite annoyed by that, and quite rightly, we as ISOC thought we need to do something about it. So we decided to complain to the university, and the process was prolonged, and it was we were met with so much resistance and powerful resistance, should I say. But alhamdulillah, ultimately, towards the end, although the aim wasn't to raise awareness, rather to have the module scrapped and, have the professor reprimanded. But alhamdulillah, the good thing that came out of it is that there was so much awareness of how deceiving, how deceptive things can be, like how structurally inbuilt Islamophobia can be, even in our education spaces, in the name of free speech. And
if I remember rightly, the major news outlets, they picked up on it. If I remember rightly, the major news outlets, at the time, they picked up on this particular case and reported on it fairly widely, didn't they?
That's right, yeah. I was approached by so many reporters as well at the time. I remember having, receiving requests about interviews and statements, but we felt as ISOC wasn't in a position to talk about, because that time the complaint was still quite confidential and in the process. So we just made some really general statements about the case, and stay away from making any comments. But essentially, we were kind of in a position put by the university saying, look, this is very confidential, you cannot talk about this, and if you were to talk about it, you will be facing consequences. So a bit
Don't you think that could have been Islamophobia as well, though? I feel like not allowing an Islamic society to have a voice. I mean, was there anything did you feel like you were being constrained? I mean, sure, it looks to me like there's a university that's already dealing with some sort of other crises at the same time, and then this other issue has come along. It seems like the PR machine may have been trying to protect itself.
That's right. For them, it's more about their reputation and the prestige of the university, which matters more than the welfare of the minority students. And they, again, repeatedly shown that with various different campaigns. So we went.
Did you feel threatened?
We're different. Not necessarily by the uni, but well, obviously we felt quite disadvantaged in the process, and didn't feel like it was done fairly, because initially they were supposed to reach out to us fairly quickly, but they gave all these reasons about delays and backlog and COVID. But ultimately, you know, if there is a will, there's a way, right? The university didn't show any urgency to the case and made it very challenging for our students.
Okay. Well, listen, brother, I can only commend you for going through with it. What was the outcome, if we might ask?
So the outcome of the case was they didn't uphold any of the claims. They said that there wasn't enough evidence to...
They rejected it in its entirety?
In essence, yeah.
Despite the recordings that you had, which were clearly inflammatory.
But, you know, in education spaces, that's what... you know, it comes down to the point about free speech and academic speech. That is what ultimately...
Right.
All other points.
And did you go public with that information afterwards when you received the rejection?
They were kind of telling us to make statements, but I sort of lost touch with what happened afterwards, because the next president took on, and I think we went through another direction. But
right.
Ultimately, sort of that year ended in somewhat of a, you know,
disarray.
Yeah.
Right, Ahmed, thank you very much for that. You know, I feel like I feel like you have a lot to tell us about, you know, your personal experiences. But now I want to ask you a wider question: Islamophobia, denial. How can we tackle denial? How do you see denial?
So, the way I understand this question is more of how can we become confident about our identity as Muslims, first and foremost. I genuinely think, as Muslims, we have to have a very good relationship with our religion. So if someone were to make Islamophobic statement or have Islamophobic actions, if we don't know our religion enough, we can feel quite intimidated by it. So knowing our religion, knowing what Allah wants us from this position, is the key to actually tackling all these dilemmas. So reconnecting ourselves with our relationship, improving our journey with our Quran, Hadith, lessons from the Seerah, all of this is actual individual growth and development. But as collectively, we like I said, I can have all the knowledge and confidence as individuals, but we can't fight structural Islamophobia, which can only be fought when we all come together as individuals and work with the organizations who are doing research and campaigning and things like that. So as Muslims, we collectively have to come together and fight Islamophobia.
Yeah.
Because individually we can't do that.
On that topic, did you feel that you could reach out to any organizations when the ISOC was going through its strife?
So the first organization we reached out to was FOSIS, which I'm not sure if most of you are aware. So Federation of Islamic Society. So it's like an umbrella organization that all the ISOCs work together. So FOSIS have enough of good platform for us to kind of use them. And they gave us, alhamdulillah, lots of advice privately and sort of gave their expertise. So we benefited a lot. But also there were other organizations and individuals who I'm not going to name them here, but they also kind of played key role in, you know, helping us as students. But ultimately we were, you know, a few students who are studying full time and, you know, having to do voluntary ISOC work. So we didn't have all the resources and time. So having these organizations helped us massively.
Yeah, and I think in future, maybe this is a classic case that could be referred to the Islamophobia response unit, because they have the know-how, the legal know-how. They have barristers, they have, you know, people like myself who are just, you know, lawyers with a opinion on pretty much everything. And we tend to be quite useful at in these kind of weird scenarios. Like I'm seeing from our discussion right now, Aamir, that there's a few things that perhaps having somebody legal on board would have done slightly differently, because obviously the angles of approach are different. So immediately I would be concerned about the fact that you're being told essentially that you can't go public with an active inquiry or active case. This isn't a court of law, there's no requirement for you to have done that. But I feel like these organizations, it's almost like a David versus Goliath situation, and students, especially Muslim students who don't have a very strong entrenched legal community, might feel pressurized by. That's why I asked you, did you feel threatened? Because it really wouldn't surprise me if an institution may have even used your personal liability against you. So if, for example, any reputational damage is caused, that you're personally liable for that, even though you're acting as part of a society.
Also, there was power dynamic that you may not see as outsiders, because we were students and they were university with institution and wealth and resources. We were up against the establishment almost. So we felt like we had to come to a middle ground, kind of like, okay, they're listening to us, so we have to listen to them, that sort of thing, and not knowing our rights and what we can do and what's within our kind of capability, really. So it's about knowing your rights, but also feeling a bit more confident. And obviously that will come if you reach out to certain organizations. But again, as students, most people would not think about reaching out much. They will think about, okay, what do we do? And so our case is honestly a good example for why you should reach out and speak to the experts. Even if you don't know all these organizations, the best you can do is actually going to somewhat national kind of organization like FOSIS, for example, who will then have contacts within their reach, and things like that. So reaching out to somebody, I think, is most important.
That's helpful. And I mean, really, I think with the idea of this Islamophobia Awareness Month, it's helpful to have these stories, these anecdotes, and also maybe an element of lessons learned. How do we progress further, and what can we now do? So inshallah, I'm now going to bring to the fore Rizwan Ahmed. If we could have his screen enlarged, admin, please. Rizwan's going to talk to us a little bit about the nature of Islamophobia. I'm going to turn my camera off, and we're going to hear a little bit from Rizwan about Islamophobia and his particular experiences from years and years of work in this space.
Yeah, Jazakallah for that. Let me just get the presentation going. Hopefully it's going to work. Can you all see the screen? Hello? I can't see anything now. Can anyone see the screen? I can't hear anyone. Hello?
Yeah, see the screen, yeah.
Screen, okay, cool. So what I thought I'd share, because I have a presentation specifically on Islamophobia, and normally I share with adults, schools, and universities, etc., etc. I've had to truncate it a bit, because obviously, normally it's like 45 minutes long, but I've truncated it to try and get the key points across. But what I found is that when I take this approach, and I always come from a grassroots perspective, I've never come from an academic angle, because I find sometimes when you have an academic discussion, things get lost and no actions come out of it. So I've always found that when I've come from a grassroots perspective, I find it's had a much more harder hitting impact on the people I'm talking to, and then people have taken action after. So what I'm going to do, I'll talk a bit about, just to set the scene and give a bit of context. One thing that I've always found with Muslims and Muslims, to set the scene, is talking about just touch on the brief history of Islam and I suppose the Muslim community in the UK. And then I'll look at Islamophobia as well, a few definitions, some of the things feeding into it from my experience that I've picked up over the years. And then we'll look at the impact it's having on the British Muslim community. And then we'll also look at some solutions, and I'll share some personal anecdotes as well, where I've seen how you can change things in attitude as well. And then we'll just finish up. Basically, I want to end on some positivity, because sometimes people can over worry and they get bogged down in negativity. So I've always taken a positive approach to tackling it, and then obviously we can carry on the discussion after. So hopefully, if I behave myself, this shouldn't take more than 15-20 minutes. So someone's gonna have to keep an eye on. But anyway, if we crack on then, so if we look at the history side of things first, and just before I do that, just to touch on the issue of education dialogue, this is what we'll go through roughly, because obviously one of the things I forgot to mention is that we do want to look at if is there a link between the media and perceptions of Muslims as well. But I think there's a brilliant quote that sums up, the approach I've taken over the last 10 years. Hello?
Sorry, you haven't pressed from beginning. You haven't actually, we can see your presentation at the window, but you haven't actually pressed from beginning.
Let me stop sharing. I'll share again. Let me start again. Hold on. So from beginning, let me present, share screen window. Can you see it now?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you.
Is it moving forward now?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Okay, Alhamdulillah, it's moving forward. That's brilliant. So this is, again, I've talked about what we're going to go through already. And I think the one thing, as I said, I forgot to mention, look at link between media and perceptions as well. But before I do that, I think I just want to share this quote from Ibn Rushd, who is a famous religious Islamic philosopher from the past. And he said, ignorance leads to fear leads to hate, and hate leads to violence. That's the equation. So basically he was saying education dialogue is very important because ignorance can play a big factor in people having Islamophobic thoughts. Anyway, looking at the history side of things first then, many people don't realize that the contact, many Muslims actually don't realize the contact between the British Isles and Islam actually goes a long way back. And we know that because of different artifacts and things found over the years. So for example, one of those was this King Offa's gold coin. So King Offa was someone who ruled the middle of England 1250 years ago. He had this gold coin made. And what's unusual about the coin, as you can probably see on the screen, on the left-hand side, it's got his name Offa Rex in Latin. But on the right-hand side, in Arabic, it's got written, there is no God but Allah, and Mohamed is the messenger. So, La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. Yeah. There's a couple of theories as to why he made the coin. One was maybe, to trade with the Muslim or Arab world. Another theory was, I've read before, that he actually wanted to annoy the Pope at the time. What better way to do that than put something Islamic on a coin? But more recent theory I came across about 4 or 5 years ago was that he's actually up to no good making knockoff money, counterfeit money, and this coin is a product of some of that knockoff money. But regardless of why he made it, it shows that within 150 years of Islam beginning, there's already some sort of contact going on between, the British Isles and the Muslims. Because again, many people have a perception that the contact with Islam is quite modern, 1960s, etc., because of the workforce that came up. It actually goes back a long time, as I said. Moving along, they also found this is called a belly coating cross. Again, a cross normally represents Christianity, of course, but what's unusual about this cross is that it actually has some Arabic inscribed in the middle, and the cross dates back to the 8th or 9th century, and they found it off the south coast of Ireland somewhere. But I think the inscription says, in the name of Allah or something like that. So not quite sure, but again, it's another, artifact hinting at this contact. Going over to Europe for a bit, this is a ring recovered from a Viking grave. The ring dates back to around 850 AD. It's a Viking ring from a Viking grave, as I said. What's unusual about the ring is that it also has the word to Allah or for Allah inscribed on the ring. So another artifact hinting at this contact. And I remember, I think it was about 5-6 years ago, there's another news report where they said that they'd found more Viking clothing, and that had Arabic inscriptions on it as well. Coming back to mainland UK, the first official mosque in the UK was opened in Liverpool in 1889. It was opened by that brother there in the bottom left-hand corner, Abdullah Quilliam, who's actually a white British convert to Islam back then in Victorian England. Those couple of buildings there was their mosque. He actually called it the Liverpool Muslim Institute or something, and it wasn't just a mosque. So he used to run an orphanage from there, a publishing house. He was doing all sorts, and he's so proactive in his community and so clued up, actually. And this is something we can learn from, is because one of the reasons he set this place up, I'm just going on a sidetrack here, yeah, he, as a Muslim, he felt that at that time, Christianity had let down the poor. So he felt as a Muslim, I need to give to society and bring a change to help these poor people I'm seeing. So hence why he started this place. But one of the key things he actually used to do was, on Christmas Day, he would actually have a Christmas dinner for the poor people inside the mosque, the local poor people. Yeah, so he's very, very proactive and forward-thinking. This is a picture of the mosque back then. You can see it's very Victorian in style. It's got that Islamic twisted design of it. And you can see on the picture on the right, there's Quilliam himself praying at that time in the mosque. Unfortunately, Quilliam He, after about 20 years, one day just packed his bags and with his son, he just left. And when that happened, the mosque shut down and the whole community that was there fizzled out and disappeared. And there's some estimates say like maybe 200 to 500 Muslims living there at that time in Liverpool, and the majority were probably white British converts. And they actually suffered a lot of Islamophobia at that time. Yeah, so they went through a lot. But yeah, so the mosque disappeared, all fizzled out, disappeared, but the mosque did reopen again in June 2014 after 106 years. So the charity that got together and they renovated the building and got it all up and running again. And of course, you can see it looks very different now inside compared to back then. And as far as I know, I think it's part of the local heritage there as well. But anyway, so that community disappeared. But I would say their spiritual successors are these guys in Norwich. So this is a very unique mosque in the UK, in that it's run mainly by white British converts to Islam. And one of the reasons I like to highlight this community is because I've often found in my work over the years is, people think, if you choose to follow Islam as a faith, then you suddenly compromise your whole cultural identity. That's not the case. Yeah. So, often people, because of media perception, they think if you become a Muslim, you suddenly become an Arab and start shouting Allahu Akbar and God as well. That's not the reality. And these guys are living proof of that. Yeah. So, for example, if you look at the hijab that the women are wearing, it's a very Western British style of hijab that they're wearing. I remember there's a documentary on Channel 4 about nearly 10 years ago now, and they were actually following different mosques around the country, seeing how they were marking Ramadan. And the presenter himself was actually Pakistani. So he goes up to these guys, goes, right, where's all your samosa, pakori and stuff like that? They were like, oh, no, we don't eat that. We have like soup and probably sandwiches and stuff like that. Very British food compared to what we eat in our mosque sometimes. But suffice to say, what these guys highlight is that you don't have to compromise your cultural identity because you choose to follow Islam as a faith. And mashallah, they're actually thriving and doing well as a community up there in Norwich at the moment. Coming back to mosques again, the first purpose-built mosque in the UK was this one in Woking in 1889. This mosque is also unusual in that it wasn't actually built by the Muslim community. It was actually commissioned by a Jewish man called Dr. Gottlieb Wilhelm Lettner, and he had the mosque commissioned back then for Muslim students to pray in. Now, eventually, the mosque was bought off Dr. Wilhelm Lettner's son by the Muslim community, and it stayed with the Muslim community ever since. This mosque still looks exactly the same from the outside. Of course, it's very different on the inside. This is a picture of them praying the Eid prayer, Eid Salah, back then in the late 1800s. And I'm hoping this works next, but I've got some old news footage of them praying Eid Salah in the early 1900s as well. I hope this works. Oh, alhamdulillah, it's working. So here you can see them praying Eid prayer outside in the early 1900s. Obviously, it's a bit pixely. I apologize for that. And apparently, Quilliam, that brother Quilliam, he did reappear towards the end of his life at this mosque, and he spent his final days. He's actually praying in the front row there, but I've not worked out where he is yet. Yeah, but alhamdulillah, I love this clip. It just gives an atmosphere of what things were like at that time. Yeah, this is something we've talked about. We touched on perception and Islamophobia, and I always like to share this. I never know where to put it. It's always sticking in the history part. Yeah, but this is something that gets a lot of people thinking, especially about the hijab. So what I'm going to show you now are pictures from a documentary called Edwardian Britain in Colour. And this is from up in Manchester, near Manchester in 1901. And if I didn't give you any context, a lot of people look at this picture and think, oh, that's a Muslim country, that is. No, that's what women were wearing. Obviously, this is what working class women were wearing at that time in Manchester in 1901. And it could be, there may be different reasons why they weren't. Maybe it's all they could afford. Maybe they were trying to keep warm because of the cold. But what I find interesting about this is, why is it culturally it was acceptable to wear this back in the early 1900s in England? But now, fast forward to 2022, if a Muslim woman wears this, or even less actually, somewhere less, it's suddenly a big issue. It's oppression, this. So it's just something to think about. Where's that cultural shift come from? And again, that's something we can talk about later on as well. Yeah. Let's skip the comfort break there. So let's look at Islamophobia now, the effects of Islamophobia, is that linked with the media, my personal experience, and some final thoughts as well. So I'm a bit older. So what we have found in the UK, I'm just talking about the UK, focusing on the UK, is that we know it's always been there, but there's been a creeping rise since the 1990s. And some of the things that have been feeding into it, we've had the complicated geopolitical climate, and ISIS and all that stuff going on. we know there's a lot of media misrepresentation that feeds into it. Things like recessions. We had one back in 2008. We're going through another one. Those things make it worse as well. We've had, especially in the last maybe 8 years, we've had a big rise in far right politics and hate groups as well. We had all that stuff with Islamic State going on. And I say openly, political correctness doesn't help too far. That make things worse. And also, we've seen politicians wooing far right voters as well. That's not made things. And also, what doesn't help, we have to be honest, is sometimes as Muslims, some make gaffes, and unfortunately, when we make mistakes, they get magnified in the media, and they play into that narrative of what people have in their heads anyway. So things like that don't help as well. But as I said, I suppose one of the biggest things has been the proliferation of hate groups that present Islam as a threat to the West. And unfortunately, if you go stateside in America, it's become a whole growth industry over there. So there are people making absolutely millions and millions of dollars just on the back of spreading misinformation about Islam and Muslims. And for example, there's a whole cabal of them that do it. But what's sad is that these guys, going back 10 years, they wouldn't have had a platform, but people like Fox News and others give them a platform, and it's amplified their misinformation. And to illustrate how much money they make out of it, there's a guy called Robert Spencer. He has different websites. He's written many books over the years. He got investigated by, I think it was the Tennessean, like back in 2008 or something, 2010. And they found that just from his tax returns, in 1 year, he'd earned about $130,000, $140,000, something like that. God knows how much he's earning now, yeah? The people who are paying him, because a lot of these guys, what they do, they have a charitable organization at the front, as a front, but behind the scenes, they're just spewing out Islamophobia. And the people who paid him, I think they were called the David Horowitz Freedom Center, they earned like $400,000 around that time. So, and again, God knows how much they're earning now, yeah? But I think one key thing as Muslims we have to remember, and this is something I teach non-Muslims and Muslims as well, there's a big, big difference between criticizing Islam and demonizing Islam and its followers, yeah? And I think I always teach, look, there's nothing wrong with criticizing Islam. You're allowed to do it. You're allowed to say, look, actually, I don't agree with the fact that you have to wear hijab. I don't agree with the fact you can't eat pork. I think I don't like it that you pray separately in the mosque. Nothing wrong with that. What's wrong is when people say, actually, you're not all terrorists. You lot all like to beat your women, etc. That's Islamophobia. That's what's wrong. And what worries me, and this is something I forgot to say in my introduction, is that, if as a nation we don't deal with this, we are sleepwalking into a big, big problem. And one thing I forgot to say at the beginning, I always stress in my introduction, is that, you imagine as a country, as the UK, yeah, we're like one big solid brick wall. Yeah. Now, if you start poking holes in that wall and pushing out some of those bricks, what's going to happen to that wall structurally? That wall is either going to get weak or collapse. Yeah, and what we're finding over the last 10 years, especially and anecdotally, and through when you collect statistics, etc., is yes, we've got Islamophobia growing, but in the wake of it, unfortunately, the Hindu Sikh community is affected by it as well, because they look like us sometimes, so they suffer Islamophobia. And then on the trail end of that, you got rising anti-Semitism as well. So what it's done, Islamophobia, it's like almost like, yeah, it's encouraging other types of hatred to grow as well. Yeah, but in general, I don't want to go into too much detail on this, but because I think a lot of it is common sense. But the general definition is just that fear or irrational fear of hatred of Islam and Muslims and their culture, and the fact that we're seen as fanatics and violent tendencies towards non-Muslims, reject democracy, etc., etc. Basically, it's a set of negative assumptions made about all Muslims in general. There was an official, an all-parliamentary group on British Muslims who did come up with a definition. And unfortunately, the government sort of not gone along with it at the moment. But it says that Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expression of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. Yeah, and that can express itself in various ways. People justifying the harming or killing of Muslims in the name of fascist ideology, stereotypical allegation that we're all terrorists, and we applied to groomers, all sorts of stuff. Yeah, we can talk about it later on. Yeah, now in terms of the effects of Islamophobia, the Runnymede Trust did some research in the early 90s, and of course these things have all got worse. So what they found back then from the research was that the four main areas where Islamophobia is affecting the British Muslim community. So you had exclusion from politics and government, in employment, from management and responsibility. Muslims were experiencing discrimination in employment practices, in provision of services like education, health, prejudice in the media and everyday conversation, and of course violence in terms of physical assaults, vandalizing property, and verbal abuse. And of course, that last one, that's all sort of getting worse, and online is just gone crazy. And of course, in the real world, things can be problematic as well sometimes. This is something I like to share just to show how bad things can be online. So back in 2009, I got a bit bored. I think it was that Boxing Day, and there was nothing to watch on TV really. So I went online. And by the Google worked different back then. So I was just a bit bored, and I started typing in things into Google like kill Muslims and see how many hits were coming back. And then you can see the results there yourself. I hope you can all see the screen. But things like Google UK came back with just under 1.5 million hits. And I started thinking, what? This is mad. What's going on here? Yeah. So I started coming up with other stuff. But back then, Google would also suggest other things for you to look at based on what people were searching anyway. So suddenly, things like Islam, evil religion in the UK were coming back with just under 10.5 million hits. And then if you look at the next page, I don't, some of you guys know me, I don't normally use bad language, but you can see what Google was telling me to look. And basically, these are things that people were actually typing into Google at that time, looking for. And yeah, because it was out there. And this is what people were searching. And I started thinking, you know what? Wow, this is crazy. What is going on out there that's causing all this hatred? Yeah. Looking at some figures nationally and locally. So back in 2018, the Home Office released some figures where they said in 2018, general hate crime rose by 40% in the UK, but 52% of those hate crimes were directed towards the Muslim community. Some more updated figures. So from March 2020 to 2021, again, there was a surge in hate crimes directed towards Muslims. I think it's like a 45% rise. And just this year again, the rate went up again, and there was a 42% increase since last year on hate crimes against Muslims. Then about 42% of that, was targeting mosques or Islamic institutions. Okay, so we know it's growing at that level as well. This is Scotland, but Scotland similar figures. So I won't go into too much detail on these, but 75% of Scottish Muslims said Islamophobia is a regular, everyday issue in society for them. 78% said that was getting worse. So it's not painting a pretty picture north of the border over there as well. And again, to illustrate how it is getting worse. So back, I think, beginning of this year, January, the University of Birmingham came out with some research, and it was called the Dinner Table Prejudice, Islamophobia in Contemporary Britain. And what they found is that British Muslims were now the second least liked group after Gypsy and Irish travellers. So, and they also found that more than 1 in 4 people held inaccurate conspiratorial views about Muslims and having Sharia no-go areas, etc. And surprise, surprise, half of those were like conservative and Brexiteers, etc. Yeah, and also to show the impact on young people, there's some research that came out in June 2021 by a charity in London, and they found that over 70% of the Muslims they were dealing with, young Muslims they were dealing with, they'd said those young Muslims had experienced Islamophobia. That was playing a role in the mental health issues back then. Yeah, at local level, and I'm going to talk about SARI in a bit. So we have an organisation called SARI, and they help support people dealing with hate crimes and other things. These are older figures, but on average, even if you talk to Alex, the director now, she'll tell you that on average, obviously we're Bristol centric here, but a third of their caseload is normally just dealing with the Muslim community. Yeah, locally, again, looking at Avon Somerset, and obviously the figures they produce when people ring up to report hate crime is between September 2017 and August 2019, they found that anti-Muslim hate crime was roughly 40%, 47% of all the hate crimes in the area. And just some updated figures, it's still about 42% this year, but this was affected by lockdown as well. Yeah. Now, looking at what we talked about earlier, what we can do about it. So one thing, locally, we have a group called the Tackling Islamophobia Working Group. And one thing that we try and regularly do with that is encourage reporting. And we've just found, and I've found through experience, there's a lot of apathy in reporting in the Muslim community. Reporting is very, very important. So I designed this leaflet post for WhatsApp just to encourage people to report, because what happens if we don't report? What happens then is when we try and take our case to the government or whoever, they'll be like, okay, where are your facts and figures? Anecdotal evidence is enough. You need to show facts and figures. And it's only when, as a community, we report it. So even if it's low level, it could be someone, pardon my French, let's say they call you Paki or Taliban or something like that. You have to report. If you feel it covers because of Islamophobia, you have to report it. And what will happen is, even though it's a one-on-one call, it gets logged on their system. You have to tell them Islamophobia. It gets logged. It's a statistic, and eventually that will be fed back in the figures, and it'll help build up a bigger picture when we start engaging with like government and other agencies, etc. So reporting is very, very, very important. And of course, if it's serious, life-threatening, then you have to call 999, not 111. But yeah, reporting is very, very, very important. Yeah, and even if it means actually on the sideline, I forgot to mention, it is important to record it locally. But of course, as we'll talk about, there are other national organizations that can help you and support you as well. And again, just to highlight the effect, this is an older report, but I want to highlight a key issue from this year. So back in 2013, Childline reported a 69% increase in just 1 year of Muslim kids complaining about Islamophobia in school, being called terrorists or bombers of classmates. Now, what really upset me and disturbed me about this figure is that 3 things have gone wrong here. One, why aren't these kids going to their parents for help? Maybe, yeah. Number 2, why aren't they going to their teachers for help? But for me, most disturbingly, why aren't they going to their peers and their friends for help? Why is it that these 3 systems that most young people have in their lives have failed, and they're having to go to Childline for help? So again, that's something to think about as well. Okay, and I suppose in terms of high-profile cases, over the years we've had many, but I suppose it's worth sharing a few where they've had quite catastrophic effects for the victim. So I don't know if you remember, this was back in 2017. This young woman and her cousin were sat at some traffic lights. Guy came round, sprayed a corrosive substance in them, and they experienced life-changing injuries. Alhamdulillah, they've recovered from most of it, but when the guy went to court, he showed no remorse whatsoever, unfortunately. Yeah, this is another case. This guy, unfortunately, he actually attacked a pregnant Muslim woman. He kicked her in the stomach, and unfortunately ended up losing her baby. And of course, these are at the extreme where it's worse. Now again, I'm focusing on the UK. I'm not focusing on overseas. Again, this guy on the left. Again, this is back in 2017. He was found wandering around Camberwell, I think about 4 o'clock in the morning, with a big knife, saying he was looking for Muslims to stab. On the right there, we all remember Tommy Robertson spat at a 4-year-old girl purely because her mum was wearing hijab. So this is how it can play out, unfortunately, somewhere. And even in terms of paranoia, on the left there, ironically, this woman who works on anti-radicalization, she just happened to be reading that book, Syria Speaks, a poetry book. Stewardess saw it, panicked, rang police. She got escorted off the plane. Yeah, so this is how it can play. At a local level, we've had a few high-profile situations. So the sister who was attacked a good number of years ago now, actually, but she got spat on the left. Their sister Athena, she got spat on in broad daylight, and unfortunately, no one stepped in. It was not nice. Luckily, the guy was caught. He got prosecuted. We had an attack on Tossadam Mosque quite a few years ago, where a guy was abusing the elderly worshippers. They were coming out and chucking bacon and all sorts of nonsense like that as well. So that asks the question, before I talk about the media and Muslims, is there a link between the perception of Muslims in the media and how people perceive Muslims? Again, I'm not going to go into detail on this because of lack of time, but the University of Otago did some research back in 2017, which they published back then. And what they found was, they picked New Zealand because New Zealand this is before the terrorist attack there. So New Zealand was very chilled out, very peaceful society. They had no foreign policy beef with any other Muslim country around the world. And it's actually quite chilled out and very tolerant. But what they found, though, was that when you expose people with negative information about Muslims in the media, surprise, surprise, they found that there's a linear association between media exposure and Muslim prejudice in the peaceful and tolerant society with no history of regional Muslim conflicts. So again, common sense, we know that's the case, but they proved it academically through some research. And again, when you see stuff like this all the time, obviously some of this is old, but I think this is something we have to remember. And I'm going to share some personal examples here, how people can be affected by this sort of thing. And again, then we have to look at double standards. So for example, we all think back to the Orlando nightclub shooting in 2016. The guy did the shooting, I think he had a mental health problem, but again, he's portrayed as some sort of maniac, whereas the guy who did the awful Christchurch attack in 2019, angelic boy who grew up into evil far-right mass killer. So it's just portraying things in a different light, trying to soften the blow a little bit. And again, if we think about double standards again, if we look at the Myanmar Rohingya crisis, we had many unfortunately killed by Buddhists, but no one blamed Buddhism, the religion. In India, we know things are going nuts at the moment, with the rise of far-right nationalism over there, but no one blames Hinduism. In America, you've got the KKK, Ku Klux Klan. Some of the racism is justified by Christianity. Or you've got the Army of God, who attack abortion clinics, again, inspired by Christianity, but no one blames Christianity. So what you find is that, whenever a Muslim happens to do something, the whole religion and faith is blamed for it. And I think this a key thing I want people to understand now. And again, this is talking about different bubbles we live in. Whether we like it or not, we are all influenced by this, by drip feed effect, and it influences our psyche of all of us. And even myself, as a British Pakistani Muslim, I remember, I went on Hajj in 2008, and I'd never been to Saudi Arabia my whole life before, but purely because of what I'd seen on TV about Saudi Arabia, I just thought, what, it's going to be awful when I get there. There's going to be like cops everywhere. Women are going to be locked away at home. It's going to be awful, like backwards. When I got there, I was like, oh my God, this is nothing like what I saw on TV. I was like, look, there's women walking around shopping. Oh, look, they've got shopping malls. And oh, there's Debenhams there. There's Next. They've got Mothercare. Oh, they've got the Body Shop. My eyes were totally open. But what hit me was that I realized that, what, as a British Asian Muslim, my perception of fellow Muslims was shaped by what's in the media. So if it's affecting me, how is it affecting mainstream society? That's something you've got to think about. And it's the same when I've gone up north as well, because of what I've seen on TV. Because I've lived down south my whole life, but when I went, I was like, oh my God, this is not what I saw on TV. And again, to share some of my personal experience, I'll be a few more minutes, then I'll wrap up. I apologize, I've gone over slightly. I've, over the years, I used to conduct 30, 40 mosque visits every year and about 30, 40 school visits every year over 10 years. As I said, I reached out to like 30,000 people through this way and other ways. But sometimes I've had some crazy Islamophobic things that were heard coming out, and I've had children ask me, why are Muslims always trying to kill us? I've had parents, pulling out their kids from mosques, refusing to go. One year, there was actually one parent that told the teacher, look, my kid's not going to the mosque because the MOD told us not to go because we might get shot there. And even myself once, I gave a presentation, and I remember after the presentation, an old lady came up and said, oh, I didn't realize Muslims had a sense of humor. So, these, and I can share many others, but, I want to finish off some positivity as well. So look at the media side of things again. I want people to think about how we come full circle since World War II. So here's some headlines from the Daily Mail. Obviously, back then they're talking about German Jews pouring into the country, and now, surprise, surprise, switch with headlines for migrants. If they're doing the same things all over again. Here's some more headlines. This is from the United States. They're talking about communism and Jewish. Now they're talking about Muslims in the same way. And I think sadly, this actually might have been, this one you're seeing here, Keep Out Alien Jews, might have actually been a meeting for Labour. I can't remember, but it was. We're seeing similar headlines again now. So in terms of solutions, as I said, education is key. That's what I've learned. Challenging negative views, abuse, etc. We've talked about at the beginning. That's very important. And the things about having confidence as Muslims to do it, but not doing it in an arrogant way. We're using our common sense, us, being smart about it as well. Tackling stereotypes, showing the different faces of Islam, educating the educators, as Brother Ahmed touched at the beginning, increase your own knowledge as well. But again, even with that, I've learned that it's knowledge with context and the way you deliver it. Because I've been in some situations where I've had to deal with people with some organization try to or mosques try and explain certain things to visitors, and they sort of made it worse because they haven't had the vocabulary to explain it, maybe, or the common sense to explain it. And I've sort of gone in, calmed things down sometimes. And again, where you can, take people to the mosque if you can, show them around. Cultural awareness training, which I was doing over 10 years, makes a big difference. And I think here's some key things now. So, as a community, we do need to engage with authorities as well. We do need to engage with politics. And I think another, if you look at going back in time, the prophetic method, how did the Prophet Prophet's companions change society? They went out there, talked to people, they engaged with them. They didn't sit in their homes. They didn't take a victim mentality either. They had faith in Allah, and they went out and did what they needed to do. That's what we need to do as well. And even, going back to politics, and again, this is my personal view, I personally think that, because often people think, the government sort it out. But if you look at the state of politics at the moment, who will people listen to more? Will they listen to a celebrity, an influencer, or are they going to listen to a politician? Yes, politicians can bring in laws to protect Muslims, but someone's still going to have some hatred in their heart. So unless you go out and engage them and talk to them, and the people who can change some of that, the allies who can help with that, whether we like it or not as Muslims, are people like the pop stars, actors, these influencers. They're the ones we need to be building allies with. And of course, other groups, etc. as well. And I think another key thing, again, my personal opinion, is that if you look at how in early, at the time of the Prophet Mohamed and his companions, they went out there. They were being socially active. They were helping the poor, the needy. They were doing this. They were speaking up for that. So we've got to be socially active as well. Yeah, just to share three. I've got loads here, but to share key personal experience where I've seen how engagement dialogue can have a positive impact. Yeah. So I remember there's some teachers I train every year. So they shoot up to Bristol, I do a 3-hour session with them, and then they zoom off to London afterwards. And I remember one year, one of the teachers, she looked really upset, like she's about to start crying. And I thought, oh no, I'm in trouble, because I have a Q&A, and sometimes I use humor. I've gone too far and get in trouble sometimes, just how I am, yeah? So I stood there waiting for this teacher to basically tell me off, have a go at me. And instead, she sort of, in a roundabout way, she actually admitted to being biased in the views against Islam and Muslims. The reason she was upset is that she had that epiphany and realized that, you know what, everything I knew before was a load of rubbish, basically. These were the facts and the reality. What hit me was that as a professional, if she hadn't had that training, she may have gone on to pass some misconceptions without realizing it. Yeah. Another example was, I remember once after the Brussels terrorist attack, this gentleman got in touch with BMCS, and he wrote a very, very angry email saying he wanted to talk to someone immediately right now. Yeah. He was so angry, his whole email, he actually wrote in the subject header. He didn't even get to the body of the email. Literally, we had to scroll through the subject line to read what he actually wanted. So rather stupidly, I met him by myself in the office. He was like 6 foot something. For the first 5-10 minutes, I just let him rant and rave, get stuff off his chest. He's very, very angry. He had a lot of anger in him. Yeah. After that, I just started talking to him, answering some of his questions, misconceptions, use a bit of humor. I connected with him as a human being, as a human to human. After about 45 minutes, an hour, he left. He shook my hand and he said, you know what? I wish more people like me could meet more people like you. The world would be a better place. Alhamdulillah, he left a changed man. Yeah. One last example I'd share before we wrap up is, like I said, I dealt with many schools over the years and did many mosque visits. And I remember one year, the teacher rang. She rang me a few days before the visit and said, listen, I want to warn you about one of the boys coming to the session. He's been saying the most awful things about Islam and Muslims in the classroom. He's obviously picked up from his parents. Yeah. So I said, look, don't worry about it. Let him come. He can say whatever he wants. It's not a problem. Yeah. So, I do the mosque session. We do the Q&A. Then afterwards, the teacher then goes to the boy, look, what do you think? The boy, he was like 9-10 years old. He just sat there, he's really emotional. And he just goes, I'm speechless. That was his reaction. And I've had kids come up, hug me sometimes and say, I think you're not a terrorist. No, you're not. So, I'm hoping that these, just a few examples here, show the impact it can have. And I don't know if you can see this, but these are feedback letters I've had from kids saying that I used to think, Muslims were mean, but now I know that they're kind and close to God. And thank you, because it changed how I thought about Muslims and how most Muslims are peaceful. It really changed my thoughts about its religion and not all that everyone is terrorists doing bad. Let me skip that. And I think the last couple of things I want to share, just 3 quotes and I'll wrap up. I promise you. I apologize again for going over time, but because some people say, what's the point? And it's such a huge task to tackle. What difference will I make? And there's a story I always share, but you probably read on the screen the story of the starfish. But just to summarize it, once there's a guy walking along the beach, there's like thousands of starfish just stranded on the beach, and this boy is picking up the starfish, just chucking them in the sea. The guy goes up to him, "Well, what are you doing?" And he goes, "Oh, I'm chucking these starfish in the sea before they dry up." And he's like, "Well, there are thousands of them. What's the point? What difference are you going to make?" And the boy just picked up another one and said, "Yeah, but I'll make a difference with this one." And this is what I've learned, is that when you go out and you deal with people and you talk to them, you're making that difference one starfish at a time. But I reached out to 30,000 people over the last 10 years, but to the ripple effect, maybe that became 90,000. I don't know, because people do go and talk, and I found when you educate people, they're like, "Oh my God," they talk to other people. So you can make a difference. And I think the final 2 things I want to finish on, the Prophet ﷺ told us that whoever amongst you see an evil action, let him change it with his hand. If he cannot do that, then with his tongue. And if you can't do that, at least just test it in your heart. But that's the weakest of faith. And of course, we do it within the framework of the law. And I think the last thing I wanted to share, which I suppose has Islamic principles, but I think it should be our approach to it as well, is Kofi Annan, of the previous leader of the UN, said, "Ignorance and prejudice are the handmaids of propaganda. Our mission, therefore, is to confront ignorance with knowledge, bigotry with tolerance, and isolation with the outreached hand of generosity. Racism can, will, and must be defeated." Yeah. So I think that perfectly sums up the approach we should take as well. And I apologize for going over time. I'll stop now. So back to you, Aziz and guys, and we can carry on our discussion there.
No, Riz, firstly, thank you very much for that. I see the very, very great merit in that presentation. You spoke about it before we had this call, and I really didn't expect it to be as touching as this, because it was a visual reminder. It was a show of that Muslims firstly have legitimacy in this country going back years and years. That's what really touched me. And a lot of the criticisms that Muslims face, I find that, through things that you mentioned in your presentation, we can rebut those. And I think a key part of challenging Islamophobia is knowing quite how to rebut Islamophobia. A big part of it is calling Islamophobia out as it is.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. Aamir, did you have any thoughts about Rizwan's presentation?
MashaAllah, that was so good, alhamdulillah. I genuinely learned a lot from your presentation. Just there's so many bits of information that I thought, wow, that was just fabulous. I think a lot of people don't see that side of Britain. It's the story that's often portrayed in the media is migrant, Muslims and migrant Islam, but actually there's a lot of progress that was made, but the power of media and the narrative that ultimately takes sort of what perceives how people perceive Islam. So alhamdulillah, yeah, that was really impressive.
One thing I haven't shared there is, because when I do my presentation on demystifying Islam and Muslims, because I talk about the article of faith, what we believe in, and how we practice the faith. But when I do it, I always, because again, people forget, this is something Muslims forget yet, that cultural awareness is a two-way street. You have to remember who you're talking to. Just as you want them to understand you, you have to understand who you're talking to. So what I've always done, because I've got separate story of how I came about Islam, so I wasn't always a practicing Muslim, but so I see things from both sides of the fence. And I went through the same journey a lot of reverts go to, because at one stage I wouldn't even pray Eid Salat. That's how far away from Islam I was. I actually thought Eid Salat Islam was a white man, a blue-eyed white man who died on the cross, because that's what I grew up with. Yeah, but alhamdulillah, Allah guided me back. But anyway, when I explain the articles of faith and how we practice, I always say, look, I'm going to explain to you as a British Muslim within the context of living within the UK and Western society, and that's what helps people get their head around everything. So it's again explaining with context, and then you make that connection. And even when I explain Sharia, for example, I explain to Muslims, non-Muslims, such a way, they're like, oh my God, that's for me as well. Thank you, because normally all they hear is like, we want Sharia, we want this, and they think of harshness. But it's as you guys said, it's sort of it's just, you know, getting people to understand. And I've just found, trust me, that over the years, I'll give another example. I did that presentation at because you can't change everyone, yeah. But I did a presentation at Eastern Community. I had to open up, and I did a shortened version of that. But the police tipped us off and told us someone from the far right is coming to that presentation. Yeah, I worked out who he was because he was sat like this the whole time, very aggressively. So I sussed out who he was. But anyway, during the Q&A, I said to him, "Look, okay, look." He goes, "Actually, can I make a point, please?" I said, "No problem, fire away." And he goes, "I don't like Islam or Muslims." I was like, "No problem, you're entitled to that opinion." But he goes, "You said 3 words that changed my whole opinion about you. The fact that you call yourself a British Asian Muslim." That's all it was. That's all it took. Because in his head, he'd just been taught, "Oh, you guys are separate. You want to do this, set up your own little state." So, words can have such big impact. And, it's... This is a truncated version of what I showed you. The full thing has, much more impact. But yeah, education, dialogue, very, very important, I would say.
No, I completely agree. And I guess that is a part of being aware, right? So being aware of what is current Islamophobia like. Like the Islamophobia of 10 years ago was maybe terrorism focused, and we were seen as a threat, a vicious threat to society. Now, I guess the threat is more evolved in that we're seen as a cultural threat. We're bringing our way of life. It's less about security and more about, are we endangering British values? Are we behaving in a manner contrary to British values? Now, I think we should try as Muslims to focus on the commonalities. Like I love this country. There is no other country in the world I would rather be than the United Kingdom. I get offers all the time to go overseas, or we're friends in nearly every country in the world, at least in the Eastern world, and there's nothing that would make me move because I love this country. And I feel like as Muslims, perhaps being more vocal in our ownership of this country. I mean, England and the UK generally have amazing things about it, in the sense that I probably can practice my faith better in this country than I could in my ethnic country.
Exactly. And there's some statistics I took out because I won't show the presentation yet, but I always tell people this is one of the best places in the world to be a Muslim. Yeah. A couple of years ago, I did an interview with a French journalist. She was visiting Bristol with her friend, and I did an interview. He interviewed me. When after the interview, we started talking about life as a British Muslim versus a French Muslim. Yeah, and I just talked about organization and halal shops and this like that. She actually started crying. She goes, "You know what? You've got paradise here. What you described to me is paradise. What you're talking, we can't do in France. We are so lucky to have what we have here.
We are really lucky.
And it's, as I said, it's one of the best places in the world to practice. There was something else I was going to say. I've forgotten now. Hopefully, I'll come back to you. You might remind me.
Yeah,
it was a very important point on that note about this being a very good place to practice your.
Aamir, I'm curious for your thoughts actually in your profession. Do you come across instances of Islamophobia?
I wouldn't say blatant Islamophobia, but there's a lot of little microaggressions.
Just so that everybody knows, could you detail a bit about your profession and what you're currently up to?
Oh, yeah. So I'm a fifth-year medical student, so currently on placement in hospitals and GP practices. So I get to see, by being in Southwest, you're already exposed to a white majority demographics. And so you see all sorts of patients. Alhamdulillah, majority of patients are very nice and kind and friendly, but you do get odd ones here and there that may look at you in a way like, how can this person be having medical knowledge? Surely they should be supervised by someone else, and things like that. Which obviously I'm not going to take it personally. That's people's ignorance, and I'm not responsible for how people feel. I'm only responsible for my own feelings. Yeah. But I think microaggressions are quite much harder, I would say, to deal with than blatant Islamophobia, because if someone is being, overtly Islamophobic, you can call them out. But if they have, prejudices and biases, and you have to know them fairly well to actually tackle that. Otherwise, it will just be like, that was awkward. And
on that note, actually, on microaggressions, I have a question, I guess, for Riz and you, Aamir. Somebody came up to me the other day and said that they're a Muslim student, female, obviously Muslim, who they wear hijab and the burqa as well. And they said, look, I don't understand it, but every time I go to a lift in Senate House, and there's an option for somebody to take another lift, the lift next to me, my lift will always be empty, and I present no threat. She's not exceptionally tall, she's not exceptionally scary looking. Why is it that in this day and age, people would rather go into a lift that doesn't have a Muslim in it than it does? Like, what can we do? Like, this is a very tricky scenario. Are we going about education the wrong way? Maybe first, Riz, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think personally, I've experienced that as well. It could be because of the whole lockdown situation, COVID. Because sometimes even at work, once things started relaxing, we were under strict orders, only one person in the elevator at a time. So sometimes what you'd find is that even though things were chilled out now, you're like, when to come, oh no, sorry, I'll get the next one, even though I'm by myself. Or it could be one of my other colleagues who maybe about
right.
black
So
people.
Excuses, basically, like the Prophet said to us, find excuses.
But
don't just jump to the.
Having said that, what I've also learned is that don't be. It takes a lot of guts to do, yeah, but like conversation, just show you're a human being, basically. And I'll give another example. Once I was in, I think it was Woking, actually. I can't remember where I was now, but I went for an assessment center. And this is where I experienced first-hand Islamophobia properly. Yeah, so I went to an assessment center, graduate assessment center, and before I got there, I'd said to the guy in, look, can I pray during lunchtime? Go, yeah, no problem, mate. You can pray. So I'm like, great, excellent. Yeah. So prayer time came. I was doing my wudu ablution in the toilet. The boss found out. She banged on the toilet door saying, excuse me, the guy wants to pray. I was like, issues, get out. Go pray elsewhere. You can't pray in the building. There are loads of empty rooms everywhere. Yeah. She actually kicked me out. There's a Christian guy with me because this is, do not take that with us. I said, no, that's all right. Don't worry about it. So I went into town, yeah. And I was like, crumbs, where am I going to pray? So I went to the town hall and I went up to this the woman working at the counter. She's like, excuse me, are there any mosques around here? She's like, what? What's a mosque? I was like, oh, don't worry about it. Okay. I said, look, see that screen over there? Can I pray behind that screen over there? The display board. She's like, what? I said, sorry, I'll be quiet. 5 minutes, no noise. Just can I do it, please? She's like, yes. Went there, prayed my Dhuhr Asr, came back out, left the building. But what I did, yeah, I was like, there was actually a flower stall outside. I bought some flowers, went back in. I said, look, thank you very much. She was like, oh my gosh, you're so happy to get these flowers. But the key, what I'm trying to say is that
winning hearts and minds.
Exactly, yeah. So she probably thought, she'll probably remember that for years and years and years to come.
Right.
And it's the same in elevators. Sometimes people talk to you, just engage with them. And I remember one time I ended up explaining Ramadan to someone who I ended up talking to in the elevator. We only said hello to each other, but
right.
So don't be afraid. Smile whatever you need to do. Obviously not in a weird way, but in a nice way, not creepy way. Just a nice. If you're a bloke, obviously don't do it. It might come out the wrong way, but with the opposite sex. But just keep it. Just be a human being. And unfortunately, whether you like it or not, as I said, don't forget that people have these. When I do training about how to explain Islam, I always say to people, don't forget, they've already got these baggage in their head sometimes. That's what they're going to have. That's what they expect from you. So when you break that stereotype, it just knocks them for six, basically. Like when that time that old lady came up and said, look, I didn't realize Muslims had a sense of humor. I was like, thanks a lot, yeah. But don't be, just be a human being. Be yourself. I know it's not easy. It's not easy for everyone to be confident in their faith, but just be yourself. That makes a big, big difference.
Okay, perfect. So that was a very whole and succinct answer. Aamir, any thoughts on our elevator example?
Honestly, I think Brother Rizwan took it, mashallah, to the next level, alhamdulillah. I really like the quote that you started with for the PowerPoint, how ignorance breeds hatred. Is it which one? Ignorance breeds hatred, breeds fear, breeds violence. Along the lines of that. So I thought the way the narrative, the story ended, it just shows systematically how it never starts. It always starts that the initial bit that starts off, and I think that's always about ignorance.
Yeah.
So, that was good.
Okay, perfect. So we now have a question from our audience. Thank you very much for the audience for raising that question. If there are any others, please let us know in the chat box below. Below the screen, there'll be some wording on how you can submit your questions. But the first question for the panel is, how do young Muslims embrace their identity as British Muslims? Aamir, any thoughts about that as a young Muslim? How do they embrace their identity as British?
Your head up, so
I got some thoughts about that I'm going to share candidly now. So basically, what I've learned is, and again, do you remember I said I've not been a practicing Muslim myself, so I see things from both sides of the fence. So when I came back into Islam, I had to teach myself how to pray again, how to fast, how to do Quran, everything I had to learn from scratch again. Yeah. So basically, I learned my faith in a way that this is a mistake many Muslims make. So you have to learn to live Islam, not do Islam. The problem is we're all taught how to do Islam. You pray, you fast, not how living Islam is a totally different thing. It's part of your day-to-day life. And excuse me, but even when it comes to the I would say I have a big bugbear with the way Islam is taught to us across the board. And for example, if you look at how, because sometimes over the years I've had to support like GCSE students studying Islam. I've had to support A-level students studying Islam. I've had to support theology students studying Islam. Yeah, that's like a whole different level. Yeah, and even at GCSE level, one of the most personally eye-opening things I learned, and I've watched them, is that non-Muslim kids are taught Islam in such an amazing, deep way with context that it's light years ahead of what Muslim kids are taught. And they actually understand, they may not have the faith, but they understand Islam in its depth and what it's about. And they're almost able to take that knowledge and apply it in a fiqh way. So, for example, they might get a question like, actually, you're a Muslim, XYZ situation happens. What do you do? They're like, okay, yep. And they'll work it out. They'll write down the answer. You give the same question to a Muslim kid. He's like, I don't know. I pray. And that's it. It's a blank, yeah? And I remember once I had some A-levels, I had a question by one school. The GCSE students came, but they said, we got a question from some A-level students. They were like, hey, no worries, far away, yeah. They were like, yeah, so Islamic State, do they follow the Asharite school of thought or Azari? I was like, what? And it just went over my head. But the point I'm trying to make is, this is the depth at which they're learning their faith, And if you don't understand, if we don't basically what I'm saying is that we don't teach our young Muslims how to live your Islam as a British Muslim, because what happens is we're taught to be Muslims in Saudi Arabia, we're taught to be Muslims in Pakistan, in India or Bangladesh. We're not taught how to be Muslims here. Can you see where I'm coming from? So we need to teach them about practicing Islam within the British context. I'm not calling for a British Islam, but just having that context and living your Islam, being taught to live your Islam, and that alone will have a big impact. And sometimes I've had to deal with like young, even simple things like, I don't want to go into it now, because that's a separate discussion, but even simple things, for me, simple, I have to explain, homosexuality to Muslims, or right. The problem is what can happen is when they're not explained properly, a lot of young Muslim kids develop conflicts in their heads and it messes them up. So you have to, it comes back to teaching properly with context. That's what will have an impact on young British Muslims. Yeah.
Riz, we should move on to the other questions. There's quite a few. Sorry about that, bro. That was really good, though. I'm not going to lie. I feel like I stopped a very valuable stream then, but I'm conscious that we've got only a few minutes left before we have to end. Yeah. So, okay. So how does discrimination impact Muslim communities? In 30 seconds or less, just a quick statement summary from each of you.
Very quickly, I think I touched on it already. So we've seen the rise of Islamophobia, but the bit I didn't touch on, it also has impacts on social deprivation in the Muslim community as well. We know that the Muslim community does suffer from social deprivation and movement through the economic ladder in the country as well. So that's how it can impact. So it can affect your progression at work. It can affect your progression in academia, etc., etc. So if we don't deal with it, that discrimination can have an impact socially and in other ways as well.
Aamir, any thoughts?
Just to add to that, I would say it impacts on a very different level. Sometimes it might not be apparent, but psychologically, we may feel ourselves as inferior or unworthy, contribution to the society. So it can mess up with our psychological well-being as well, not just on a sort of political level.
Now, I would argue that it could impact us even in our medical capacity. So today, I attended the hospital with a patient who was suffering Islamophobia, in the sense that every time they went to the hospital, particular doctors from a particular background were being very antagonistic, very judgmental, very snappy, very rude. So I put on a suit and I went with that individual and their parent, and I sat and observed. And I then, after that display of excellent care, which the patient had never seen up to that point, then said I was going to be talking to the PALS, the patient and liaison services. And I'm challenging these microaggressions and real aggressions. I mean, the individual in question told me that on one of their appointments, they were literally shouted at, like screamed at and shouted at. And I thought to myself, and I asked them when I was there, did you see an incredible change in demeanor? And he said, yes, definitely. Now I said, look, you're quite obviously Muslim. Your mother is quite obviously Muslim. You dress like Muslims. And do you think that your ill treatment could have been because of the fact that you're dressed like a Muslim? And he said, absolutely, I have no doubt about that. Now, I came dressed as an Englishman would dress, a smart Englishman. I came dressed in a suit. I don't think that as a society we should have to leave parts of our identities to be treated equally. We're all taxpayers, we're all members of society. We should be treated equally no matter what we wear. It shouldn't be somebody dressed up in a suit that comes and enforces justice. People should have it within them. So yes, I think we should call it out when we see it. We should call it out when we see it and seek advice from others. So that's my 10 cents. We have another question. What tips can you provide for individuals to combat Islamophobia on a personal basis? I think, Aamir, I feel like I'll give you this question because the next question is more suited for Riz. So what tips can you provide for individuals to combat Islamophobia on a personal basis?
So firstly, I think you need to recognize that it's Islamophobia and it's not something else. Once you've done that, you need to seek help. Talk to people that you trust, reach out to organizations that you know can contribute and help and support. And most importantly, look after yourself. I think it's very important that you look after your own well-being in the process, because otherwise, you may achieve your objective, but in the process, you will end up doing a lot of harm to yourself. So look after yourself, reach out and speak to people.
And Riz, I guess it looks like the final question is, how do you speak to colleagues about Islamophobia? You kind of touched upon this already, actually, with your matrix, but I think it's important if you just clarify, and maybe let's use points, so like 1, 2, and 3. Let's try and give the takeaway.
I'm just going to focus on the work situation here. So what I would say, most workplaces have some sort of, I don't know, they might have like where Asians get together, etc., etc. So for example, last year I did a session with DAC Beechcroft online on Hajj and Eid, etc. Internally in Somerset, I've done things to educate people and my colleagues. I've done sessions, or someone like me is happy to come in over Teams or in person, through wearing my BMCS hat and do training. Because most people, if you try and integrate it into there must be some sort of self-awareness week or something like that. They're like, yeah, here's some money, get someone in, come and do a talk. So I would say that's the time to get someone to come in, do a talk. Or, sometimes, if something happens in the media, you can raise it with your colleague, talk about it, and then share your lived experience if you've had it. That will have an impact as well. But don't be afraid to get people in to come talk about. For example, recently in Somerset, we had Race Matters Week. It just went down amazingly well. And so get people come in, talk, do presentation, education. That's what it boils down to, and that human contact. And it will take time. It'll take time, And the key thing I want to stress to people is that if you look at the prophetic method, the way Allah does things, society, things always change from bottom up, not top down. And that's how at times things change from bottom up, not the other way. As Muslims, we tend to look at the top. You've got to change at the bottom, and when we change as a community ourselves, that change will come, the help will come, etc., etc.
Definitely. I guess many thanks to all of our kind viewers who joined in, who logged in on YouTube or Facebook, and who raised very, very important questions. Firstly, please accept my apologies for any failings in technology. We hope we've covered all of the questions. We hope we've covered all of the points raised. And we thank you again. If anyone needs guidance on Islam, Islamophobia, dealing with it in the workplace, Rizwan, I'm sure you'd be more than happy for people to reach out to you either on your BMCS email address or via social media. And Aamir, again, thank you very much for joining us. And with respect to myself, again, I'm more than happy for people who are facing legal discrimination or would just want to talk about Islamophobia from a legal perspective, to lend my ear to you as well. I can be contacted on LinkedIn. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I wish you a great evening, and thank you all again. Assalamu alaikum.
سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. السلام عليكم.
Wa alaikum assalam.